Annalise Taylor, can you tell me where you're from?
I'm from Auckland in New Zealand.
So let's go right back to the basics. How big a city is Auckland?
When I lived there, there was about 1 million people, which was about a third of the population. And as far as I understand, it's larger now, but proportionally about the same. I think the whole population of New Zealand is about 5 million now.
And is it the largest city in New Zealand?
Yeah.
So would you describe yourself as a city person, brought up in a city?
I think a suburban person, because Auckland's a really sprawling city geographically, and there's a city centre, but then it's really a collection of many, many suburbs sprawling out towards various coastlines, because Auckland is an isthmus, so it has 2 harbours and there's water everywhere. But yeah, basically you live in the suburbs, not really in the city.
So describe, what was the name of your suburb, and describe your suburb?
So I was born and basically grew up in a suburb called Henderson, which was, it's hard to describe really. It's just like rows of houses. And once upon a time it had been, there were a lot of vineyards there. There are a lot of, what at the time we would have said Yugoslavian immigrants had come both before and after the World War II, I believe, and brought their vines and their plants with them. So we had a lot of orchards and a lot of vineyards when I was a child around where I lived. And it was basically, streets of houses and walk to school, and then a local centre that maybe a little bit like Harlow town centre, maybe not quite that big. But rows of shops and a small shopping centre in the middle.
And outdoor life?
A mixture. So we always had access to the beach, but it was sort of a drive that you'd go on the weekend. So maybe like a half-hour drive out to the proper beach. So when I was a bit older, I lived somewhere where I could take my children to a bit of sand next to some salty water, but I didn't call that the beach. That was just somewhere to play with the toddlers. But going to the proper beach, I could do that as a kid, but it was like a picnic at the weekend rather than just walking down there after school.
And what was the name of your schools?
So I went to Henderson North Primary, and then in New Zealand we have intermediate school for when you're 11 and 12. So then Henderson Intermediate, and then Waitakere College, which was the high school. And we didn't have sixth form colleges, so you just went to high school, and then if you were going to go on to something else, university or something, you went after that.
Favourite subjects?
English and history, I guess, but mainly English literature. Yeah.
And you mentioned history, and I know you're from the museum.
Yes.
So did you have an interest, and do you have an interest in New Zealand history at all?
Yes, I couldn't, say that I was an expert at all. I think New Zealand history is very distinct from British history in that, of course, we have an Indigenous population who arrived on our islands a long time before the colonising British and other groups. Of course, they came to those islands from somewhere else in the Pacific. And so I think growing up as I did in the 70s, we learned a certain amount about that, a lot more than the previous generation. But people who are young now in New Zealand would learn even more about that in more detail and perhaps in a more nuanced sort of way.
Because I was aware that New Zealand, what's the correct term, when its relationship with the Maoris, was it one of the earliest countries to apologise formally to an Indigenous population?
I believe so, but certainly I would say that's any post-colonial situation is very complex, and that if you are from essentially the colonising population, you're not necessarily the best person to pass judgment on how well that's been handled. And I think, of course, being from New Zealand, we would probably say that we have better race relations in some other countries, but then people who live there might not think that. I'm not Maori.
A friend of mine who lives in Sydney described New Zealand and Australia with A-levels, and sometimes, do you think that things like women getting the vote, I think one of the first countries women to get the vote,
Yes.
do you think that proves that?
Well, New Zealand and Australia, it's a long enjoyed rivalry. Well, maybe also being a smaller country, and these things are never straightforward. It sounds great, but equally, women getting the vote was really, I think, a lot more about conservative men allowing their wives to have the vote so they would vote the same as them and boost their vote. And of course it was women of property, it was women of a certain class, not all women, so same as here in the UK. So the headline sounds good, but obviously it was a very good first step. I think there's a real, like any country, there's all kinds of people in every country, and there's people have all different experiences depending on so many different factors. But I think that in New Zealand, there's quite a lot of scope for the individual, and there's quite a lot of scope for what you might call an alternative lifestyle. But the alternative to what? I mean, there's many alternatives. And so there's, people who live a very creative life, who kind of do their own thing more. I think there's a real approach. It's sort of a cliche within New Zealand, is the number 8 wire mentality, which is the idea of you just fix anything, you find a way to fix it, and the idea of Kiwi ingenuity, which I think occurs everywhere, but that we like to think that we just tend to get on with things and be quite practical, I think.
And did you or have you travelled within New Zealand a lot? And do you have any favourite places?
Not a lot, but fairly recently, my father moved to the South Island. So when I went back to see him, I was going to a different part of the country. Well, there's so many favourite places. I suppose for me, coming from Auckland, the west coast beaches of Auckland and the bush around there are my sort of favourite places that were imprinted on me as a child. And so for us, the bush, in contrast with perhaps the Australian bush or the bush in different countries in Africa, the bush in New Zealand is very lush, very green, very dense. You can get lost there really easily when you're a child and you go on bushwalks with school or whatever. You always learn, you never step off the path. It's not because there's dangerous things there, it's the landscape. People can get lost and get hypothermia or something. So it's a very green place. There's a lot of water, a lot of rivers, waterfalls, going out to the sea, a lot of coast. So for me personally, that's probably my favourite place.
When was the last time you went back?
Well, of course, I was meant to go in 2020, but I was there in 2019. And previous to that, we basically would go back, myself and my kids, every 5 years, because it costs a lot of money to fly that far, and you have to take a lot of time off work. You can't just nip home for a week. When you go, you want to go for a month, because it's, you've saved up and you've got a lot to see.
And when you lived in New Zealand, were you aware that the rest of the world seemed very far away?
Well, apart from a couple of very brief trips to Australia, I'd never been anywhere else. My parents are British, my husband's British as well, but I hadn't travelled anywhere. I suppose, in a way, yes, and I thought I would travel overseas at some point, and that would have cost money and time, and yes. I don't know, it sounds in a way small-minded, but I think I was just kind of getting on with my life. I wasn't really aspiring to big adventures, I guess, so I wasn't frustrated by it. But yes, there is a sense that, in a way, a lot of the things that are happening, that you see in the news, for example, are happening a long way away.
And do you think you'll ever go back permanently, or do you think this is now Harlow, Essex, England, UK is your home?
Well, I've lived here for 20 years now, and I remember seeing a program on the television in New Zealand interviewing someone from New Zealand who was living, I think, in Hong Kong, and had lived there for 30 years or something. And I remember thinking, how could you do that? Like, that's not your home. There was no I didn't understand how someone could feel at home somewhere that had nothing to do with their family or culture or anything, or just to be in a different place and it feel like home. I think for me, kind of people are home, and so my immediate family are here, and so that's the most important thing. I'd like to always have enough money to go back to New Zealand for holidays, and there are aspects of it that I would happily live there again, definitely. But I think, given my circumstances and my life and family and things, I think I'll be, very happy staying here, because I think your life is with the people around you, and your life is what you make of it. Wherever you live, you make the most of the things you can do there. In New Zealand, there were lots of opportunities and lots of things I could do, whether it be the outdoor stuff, but also just, everyday cultural life, things that you do. Coming to the UK, obviously, I could go to the theatre more, I could take our kids to the educational things, all the museums, and, that sort of richness, both within London, but around the country as well. So I think wherever you live, you make the most of the things that you've got there, and then your home is being with the people you want to be with.